Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this very special meeting for DigiTex member community colleges of the State Authorization Network. I'm Judith Sebesta, and I serve as Executive Director of the Digital Higher Education Consortium of Texas, also known as DigiTex, and I'd like to ask my colleague Heather to introduce herself as well.
Good morning. My name is Heather Walker, and I am the program coordinator with DigiTex. And many of you are familiar names because we have communicated through email multiple times regarding the State Authorization Network. We're glad to see you here today.
We are recording this meeting, at least portions of it that we can record. So we'll be sending out to those who might not have been able to join us today, but we really appreciate all of you who have joined us, and we hope that you find this meeting useful. Also, if you require closed captioning, you can enable that feature here within Zoom. So there is auto closed captioning available. So without further ado, as they say, I'd like to introduce the leaders of our meeting today. And we are just so grateful to them for taking the time to lead this meeting. It's really a workshop in a way for you on state authorization and other issues around regulation and compliance. So I would like to introduce Cheryl Dow, JD, who serves as Senior Director, Policy Innovations for the Wichi Cooperative for Educational Technologies and the State Authorization Network. Cheryl joined WCET in 2015. And she directs the overall activities of WCET State Authorization Network, including coordination of staff addressing interstate policy and compliance, along with other ancillary compliance issues. She brings extensive experience in education and compliance to the WCET team and is a contributing author for state authorization of colleges and universities. And she holds a JD from the University of Richmond, a master's degree in criminal justice from Bowling Green State University, and a bachelor's in political science from James Madison University. And a little tidbit about Cheryl: she's an avid fan of movies and TV shows written by Aaron Sorkin. Then I'm also so pleased that we have joining us today Karinsky, who is the Director for Digital Learning Policy and Compliance at WCET and SAN. And she joined SAN in July 2021. In collaboration with Cheryl and Rachel, she focuses on institutional and programmatic compliance rules and regulations, including accreditation requirements, international compliance when serving students by means of digital learning, and other areas. Previously, she worked on state authorization and related compliance issues for the University of Louisville. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and her JD from the University of Louisville, and she is a licensed attorney in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And a little tidbit about her: her favorite film character is the Joker, Heath Ledger specifically, from The Dark Knight. Rachel Staccio. Rachel, I forgot to ask you how you pronounce your last name. Can you tell us real quick?
Do not worry at all. My last name is Stacoviak.
Stacoviak. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I apologize.
No worries.
Rachel serves as the Director for Interstate Policy and Compliance, and as Director for this Interstate Policy and Compliance, she coordinates and builds communities of practice, strategies, and resources to address state-by-state requirements pertaining to post-secondary education. Previously, she oversaw the management and coordination of SARA with the New England Board of Higher Education, and in prior roles, she focused on building institution-wide coordination and operational capacity for improved academic services. And a little tidbit about Rachel: she is a classically trained bassoonist and is also a fan of the TV character Veronica Mars. Cheryl, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Judith. We're really pleased to be here with you today and to be able to share information with you. It's our purpose to be able to reach our members on a regular basis, to inform them about the updates and the foundations, as we will address today, of compliance. We know that this role is one that comes to staff members sometimes as other duties as assigned. And when that occurs, we know that it's important for us to be able to make sure and have these key points available to you to understand this role of out-of-state activity compliance. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who is going to get us started with this oversight. Rachel.
Wonderful. Thanks, Cheryl and Judith and Heather. Thank you for coordinating and bringing everyone together today. Pleasure to be here, and great for everyone to be in attendance today. This is an excellent opportunity for you to connect with your state peers who are engaged in compliance practices and work. Pleasure to be here today. Myself and my colleagues, if you want to move to the next slide, are going to run through about a 90-minute agenda for you today. So the first portion, we're going to recap some of the various ways our post-secondary operations sort of touch on different areas of state oversight, and then we'll connect those back to the federal rules. The second portion, Catherine's going to lead us through a guided activity to discuss relationship building within your institution, which will help to enhance your compliance efforts. And then finally, Cheryl will recap some rules around professional licensure notifications, and then we'll answer your questions. So if we can move to the next slide. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get into the content today. If you can, it's helpful if you can adjust the name on your Zoom account. If you can include your first name and maybe your institution, that'll help both us and your peers sort of get to know you in this virtual space. And I want to encourage you to please use the chat box as we move through today's event. So populate that with your questions, your comments. If you have any resources you want to share that have been helpful to you, please do use the chat. We want this to be interactive for you throughout this 90 minutes. If we can go to the next slide. Just a reminder, we are from the State Authorization Network. We are a membership organization. We're housed within the Wichi Cooperative for Educational Technologies, or WCET, as we often call it. And our mission is connected and complementary to that of WCET. We provide analysis, resources, training to institutions to help them better navigate and understand compliance implications relative to their various types of operations, including online learning and other things. Our network reaches about 800 plus institutions nationally. So you have compliance peers that you can connect with through this membership nationally, not just in Texas, but there are several Texas-based institutions who are part of the State Authorization Network, in addition to this DigiTex group. Through your participation in DigiTex, you and your institution are a member of the State Authorization Network. So you and your colleagues can gain access to our member-only resources. And that includes participation in WCET Mix, which is our discussion board and community platform. So never hesitate to reach out to share with us if there are resources or things you have in mind you're looking for, but also be sure to share this information with your campus colleagues, folks in your admissions office, your registrar, your financial aid folks, etc. If we can go to the next slide. For those who are new to this type of work, and that may include colleagues that you're working with at your institution, we have several freely available resources on our website. And following this presentation, you can visit us online and take a look at these. We have collections of articles summarizing sort of the core principles of state authorization that are listed here on the right-hand side. And a number of other resources. We have some checklists and guidance related to issuing disclosures for programs leading to a professional license, as well as a really nice document outlining 10 steps to begin the state authorization process. So go to our website, check out our resources. There's a lot of really helpful things to get started, and are all very topically focused. And on the next slide, you'll see some of those topics where we do sort of the deeper dives. You'll find research, regulation summaries. We have handbooks, talking points. There's some sample tools, checklists, for example, where you can dive more deeply into each one of these topics. We have this wonderful library on our website where you can go in, click, and then you'll see any applicable materials under those topics that we've created. So please do take a look at that, and please share that with your institutional colleagues. We'll move to the next slide. And dive into sort of the meat and potatoes of our moment here today. Before we get into the specific elements of state approval, I want to take a step even further back and talk about sort of the structure that we sit in. And I know you know this, but it's sort of an important review of an element to keep in mind that plays into the complexity of our professional lives and what we do to navigate state authorization compliance. And we have to remember we're one country. We're composed of multiple jurisdictions who are bound together in political union. And we have this document, the Constitution, that affirms those principles of the country. It defines sort of the representation and roles of the people in our government, and then creates that balance and separation of powers. In this document, we have the 10th Amendment, and that's a little bit that acknowledges that federal powers are limited to those granted by the Constitution. And then anything that sort of creeps outside of those boundaries goes over to the state. And since the Constitution is in fact silent on education, this really becomes a function, an important point of oversight for states. Within this system of federalism, states have the authority to establish and operate their constitution. And this creates sort of a legal basis for their laws and respective governments. So although states work alongside the federal government with those concurrent and shared powers, they really have an important focus on representing their rights and interests to protect the health, safety, and well-being of their citizens. So with all of that stated, we get to sort of our core idea or principle that we work with a lot in our state authorization work. And that's that it's within the state's purview to regulate activities which occur in its borders. And then if you're an out-of-state entity, that state may also have baseline approvals or procedures to enforce its respective laws for certain activities that occur within its boundaries. And these structures, laws, rules, this oversight, is really a function to protect citizens and particularly citizens as consumers. And in education, we can go to the next slide. It's really all about the student as a consumer, right? And that's at the heart of the state oversight in terms of education. So since we have states creating their own local governments, laws, this extends to how they create those regulatory bodies, or maybe a body who oversees education. So some may have a centralized entity. Some states will have like a Department of Education that will oversee all institutions, maybe including K-12. Others will have multiple and maybe decentralized entities for respective sectors of institutions or types of institutions. So there's a great variation here. And with that variation among laws and procedures from state to state. But no matter, they are all created in a way to align with sort of the governmental structure and priorities of that state and territory. But the purpose is the same, the intent is the same. And that's really that their oversight validates the mission or the educational experience and that credential that the institution is offering to that student. So for post-secondary purposes, this approval is often referred to as state authorization. Sometimes we call it a license, sometimes it's certification. But really that becomes the bedrock for most post-secondary institutions' ability to legally confer degrees and credentials to students. On the next slide, we'll just recap that a bit. So we have to recall that the initial approval for an institution to operate starts where the entity is primarily domiciled. In this map here, we have Pennsylvania highlighted in orange, right? So the state will grant some type of legal approval to the institution to open its doors to confer degrees. And that authorization, depending on the state's sort of governmental or regulatory structure, could be through a charter, maybe legislation. Sometimes there could be a board of regents or a Department of Education saying, yes, this institution may operate and confer degrees. So these entities are charged, and this approval really is structured in a way to provide or ensure that the institution can provide and has the capacity to accomplish its mission, its goals, and ensure that the students are well served. And then they also hold an important role to investigate any maybe student complaint issues that arise. So that's sort of our basis. It starts in the home state. And then Catherine, if you advance to the next, yep. we have an additional layer that comes into our work, right? So as an institution increases its operational footprint, you're enrolling students in other states, out of state, away from the main campus of the institution. We have additional approvals that may come up for the institution. So this is most common with the proliferation of distance learning, online learning. So as institutions offer programs or services, educational experiences outside of its primary state of domicile, that could trigger the need to comply with respective state laws, regulations, or procedures of a state entity based on where that activity is taking place and the laws of that state. So we'll move to the next slide. So that's the basic sort of function of the degree granting side of post-secondary operations. And that's the first point we have here on the left-hand portion of the slide. That isn't necessarily where oversight and compliance with obligations at the state level stop. So there are other areas that we have to be mindful of, particularly when you're engaging in out-of-state activities. The second obligation here listed on the slide is state registration. Here we have to remember at the end of the day, post-secondary institutions are businesses. You are generating revenue, you're employing faculty, staff, students across state lines. Maybe you're engaging in recruitment or marketing practices. So ultimately, some business functions potentially outside of your primary state of domicile. So this could lead to compliance with laws overseen by other state agencies outside of your higher education approval. So entities like the Secretary of State, Revenue, or Treasury, they may have those registration procedures as a business. A Department of Taxation may have income tax withholding for employees like faculty or staff working in another state. Or there could be digital tax, digital sales tax implications. And then there's a variety of rules, laws, maybe fees related to workers' compensation insurance, family leave, or unemployment through like a Department of Labor. So this is an area which an institution's business office or human resources division may hold some helpful information. So in addition to knowing where the institution is already registered, there could be some additional rules to be aware of in that sort of registration process. The next portion on this slide talks about professional licensure. And this is the same core principle, like again, state governmental agencies and their sort of regulatory structure will have or could have respective boards for certain professions. And this is really to establish standards and procedures which ensure that students and professionals are adequately trained, that they're demonstrating skills and abilities, and can continue to practice responsibly as experts in a given profession. So these agencies and entities choose to regulate certain professions. Often it's teaching, nursing, counseling, and there may be some sort of legal permission required to practice these professions. And with that, they will host specific requirements for educational programs, which will help to prepare a student to sit for an exam or eventually practice their chosen profession. And we'll come back to this later in today's presentation. And finally, the last sort of body we have listed here is state attorneys general. And these are entities who investigate or litigate against those who harm consumers. They're protecting us from fraud, waste, and abuse. In the post-secondary landscape, we've seen invested interest from them. They may require specific disclosures that tends to be more for proprietary institutions. They may insert themselves in sort of student loan servicing, or they may have additional laws regarding consumer privacy and data protection. So with all of that stated, we just have to remember there are multiple areas of oversight here. And the reality is that regulation is always playing catch up to technology. So although a state may not regulate a certain type of activity today, it doesn't mean that they can't choose to do so tomorrow. So if we move to the next slide, this is just a reminder here that we've talked about the state role, we've talked about the various types of oversight. and why it's so important to be familiar with different elements of operational activities of institutions which go outside of the state of the primary location of that institution. So knowing the location of your activities is absolutely critical. And the ultimate thing we have to remember here is if we don't know where these activities are taking place, we can't possibly know which laws, rules, or procedures will apply to the institution or educational activity, maybe even employees, if we don't know where these things are taking place. So the state location is critical. If we move to the next slide, we acknowledge, this is all a lot to manage. And there are some tools out there that can help. In many cases, I've emphasized here that there are different institutional contacts at your campus who hold different pieces of information who can contribute to your processes and help. There are also these interstate agreements and compacts that are in place out there. And these help to streamline and more easily manage some of the administrative burdens related to this state-by-state approval. So you can think of these as tools to support the 50-state challenge. These agreements enable institutions to engage in certain types of activities without triggering certain jurisdictional requirements or procedures. So approval to participate in them will often complement some sort of existing state approval, like your home state approval, in order to benefit from these sort of agreements. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind when you're thinking about these compacts or reciprocal agreements. These are voluntary in nature. They rely upon sets of standards and the cooperation of legal entities to make them sort of happen, to make that framework exist. We do have one example cited here, which is most common to our state authorization work, which is the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreements, SARA. And this is a reciprocal agreement which enables eligible institutions located in participating states to deliver educational programming to students located in other participating states without triggering that state higher education agency approval for certain activities. So it's important to remember again that this is a tool to support compliance. It doesn't completely absolve the institution from complying with rules which step outside of the coverage of that agreement or that entity who has approved participation in that agreement. And SARA is the most common in our distance education sort of landscape. We'll move to the next slide. So we've talked about states. We're just going to connect this to the broader landscape and in our federal landscape. In 1965, there was a federal law created, the Higher Education Act, HEA as we often call it. And this was designed to strengthen the educational resources of colleges and universities as they provide financial assistance to post-secondary students, pardon me. So this is really the foundation of where federal regulations are developed to manage higher education. And it provides the US Department of Education the ability to conduct their operations, including sort of the ability to write rules which support the functions of this law. So we've talked a lot about these rules in the past 10 or so years with regard to state authorization. And I just want to impose here that sometimes we do conflate these. So it's easy for us to maybe focus on the federal side of the house and these federal rules as a means or focal point of our compliance work. But we have to remember those respective rules of the state and where authorization really starts in our post-secondary work, which is the state level. And then remember that there's sort of an interconnected and complementary relationship between the states and the federal government, and particularly a lot of these rules too. So where these are really important, this rule is pivotal. The state is just as important, right? So there's an interconnected relationship, and one another sort of relies upon the oversight of these bodies and the respective rules. If we move to the next slide, we'll dive just a little deeper into that connection, and we can see a list of rules here. These are federal rules, citations that we often talk about in our state authorization work. We have to remember that compliance with federal state authorization regulations is tied to compliance with state laws and regulations in order to participate in Title IV HEA programs. So the legal approval of the state or states where the institution operates serves as one of those critical markers for eligibility in federal programs. And this is articulated in the first citation there, the second citation, 600.9C on the left. And furthermore, participation in state authorization reciprocity agreement, of which there happens to be one currently, can serve as evidence to satisfy this federal requirement. And that citation is listed first on this slide under 600.2 in the definition section. If you aren't familiar with the rules on the slide, you can visit our website to recap the function, and you'll find links to the specific language. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of these, but I want to mention that to you. You'll see the citation on here, which requires direct disclosures and general disclosures to students seeking or enrolling in programs with professional license.
I'm good.
I'm sorry. Mark, I think you're off mute. Okay, great. So we have our citations listed here for professional licensure notifications. These we'll talk about a little bit later. I think we have another person off mute. Do we have a question? Okay. We will come back to the professional licensure topic in just a little bit. We've also included on this slide a reminder about the citation for institutions to provide contact information for filing complaints with an accreditor or the state official or agency of the institution. But all of these are really hovering around one theme, and that's ultimately transparency of institutional systems and information which support the interests of the student. And this misrepresentation rule we have cited on here really supports that function. These call for institutions to be mindful that they aren't sharing any false or erroneous or misleading statements about the institution or the outcomes for their students. So a misleading statement, as noted in the regulatory text, can include statements that omit information. That's a really important thing to remember. So the statement omits information in a way to make it false, erroneous, or misleading, that can be a cause for investigation of misrepresentation. So we have to be careful and work closely with our marketing folks and our website developers and recruiters to keep that in mind. I want to share, if you can move to the next slide, Catherine. Just a couple more reminders about 600.9, that federal rule. This is the state authorization rule. Although the slide is really in the context of the federal language, we have to remember that we first must know the student location for purposes of state level compliance. I spoke to that earlier in the context of understanding where a variety of institutional operations may occur. But again, there's that link of where being in compliance with the state provides that eligibility to participate in federal programs. It is recommended in that language that an institution have a defensible process to determine location, and that process can be produced upon request by the secretary. So that's really important to identify at the time of enrollment and in the event a student's location has changed. So a couple quick reminders on that, and we'll move to the next slide. And finally, regulatory language, these procedures, they're all intended to help an institution to best serve its students and ultimately to get the institution in compliance. However, we do have to be aware that consequences exist out there. And obviously, these can equate to bad publicity for the institution and in some cases be disruptive to the students' progress in the program. So that can be some big scary business, but it's an important point that we just have to keep in mind as we move through developing our procedures and having these conversations with our leadership about the importance of compliance. So given time, we are going to move into, I think, the next section where Catherine's going to talk a little more about the importance of stakeholder engagement and building relationships at the institution to enhance compliance systems. So we're going to skip over these questions. We'll come back to them at the end if we can. And we'll also take more questions from you at the end. So Catherine, I'm going to throw it to you. And I'm also just going to remind folks, please feel free to insert questions, comments, thoughts in the chat as we move along. Catherine?
All right. Thank you, Rachel. And hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Karinsky. It's great to be with you all today. So this next session, it's focused on collaboration and relationship building with key stakeholders. So I have a couple of quick slides to highlight some strategies and points on relationship building and messaging with these stakeholders. And the primary aim of this session is to provide you with the opportunity to discuss questions relating to your compliance strategies and priorities and how you've collaborated with others at your institution. So this slide is a brief outline of some of the initial steps you may consider in order to start identifying who your key stakeholders are and then building connections with those people. So first, it's important to know the governance structure at your institution and to have a working knowledge of the administrative and academic units at your institution, along with a general idea of the responsibility of the units and who is the contact person for those units. It may help to keep a spreadsheet or a list of these contacts that's readily available. And it's very likely that you will collaborate with some of these units more than others, but it's still important to know who to contact in these units in the event that you do have a project on which to collaborate with them. And to build those connections, it's often a helpful place to start with your immediate supervisor. So it might be helpful for your supervisor to take a little time to introduce you and your role, either virtually or in person, to some of these key stakeholders to facilitate future collaborations. Additionally, your supervisor may already have connections with some of these departments at your institution that they could leverage, or they could also assist in reaching out with questions if needed. A common strategy that we've seen SAN members employ is the creation of a task force. This could be a helpful way of building allies and maintaining those relationships with regularly scheduled meetings and updates. So a task force of department leaders and your compliance team can create an efficient pathway for addressing compliance issues as they arise and then assigning tasks to the right person. And then importantly, once you have your team and your partners in place, you will want to set a rough communication plan that works for your team and keeps them appropriately informed. So you'll want the communication to be continuous and on a regular basis with your team and with your partners. And even if it's not always necessary to meet, just having a plan for regular updates with options such as email or using a platform such as Teams that may allow for some messaging and asynchronous collaboration. And lastly here, it can't be understated how important it is to document your work and the important decisions that are made along with your policies and procedures. Exactly how you document this will differ depending on your needs and who is meant to access the information. So you could create master documents that tracks what you've done and what you still need to do. This will really be helpful for succession planning and helpful to you and others that you work with directly to track your work and allow others to pick up where you left off. Upper level administrators may not need this level of detail, but it could be available if they request it. For those upper level administrators, you could create some high level overview documents for them that highlight the key issues, review methods that your institution's decided on to address that issue. And in these cases, some form of digital storage solution would be best for these important documents, such as institutional approvals, communications with regulators, institutional policies and procedures, and you'll want to have that documentation be readily accessible for all involved. So as you're collaborating with these stakeholders, it's important to consider your messaging and how to best get across the key information that you need in order to get the help or information that you need back from these stakeholders. So the information on this slide is a helpful place to start with really any stakeholder at your campus. And the first consideration is the audience for your message. But like I said, these general considerations will apply no matter who the stakeholder is. So generally, you're going to want to keep your message concise. We've heard many senior leaders like the use of bullet points to keep information short and to the point and organized. And if possible, keeping the information to one page or, a couple of brief paragraphs. If you feel that more information is needed, you can always provide this brief summary like I described, and maybe suggest a meeting to discuss in more detail, or letting the person know that you can provide more information if requested and if they have questions. So when you have this messaging, you'll want to focus on 3 bits of information to really get the points across. You want to list the actions that are required and then the primary sources of those requirements. So this would be, a federal regulatory citation, a state citation, SARA policy manual. Those are the kind of things you'll want to refer to. And then importantly, you'll want to emphasize how you'd like to proceed and how you'll assist other departments to meet these required actions. In my experience working at an institution, I found it very helpful to emphasize how I'm going to help those departments with the requested action so that it doesn't seem as much of a task. So really just trying to emphasize how they'll help so it doesn't seem like a burden to them. And like I said, although this information is a general guide to be used, especially when you may not know much about your stakeholders' preferences when it comes to communication, you want to keep in mind that an effective way of building these collaborative relationships will be having an understanding of how your specific stakeholders like to receive information, and then coming to a general consensus or agreement. So for example, you may find that your university's council wants more detailed information, more than one page, more than bullet points. So in those cases, you'll want to give them the information they need in order to help you. And similarly, if you have a compliance task force, they may prefer monthly email updates, but not want as many meetings scheduled or just have meetings as needed. So again, this is going to vary by institution and your stakeholders, but it's just consistency and regularity is key in communicating and messaging with your stakeholders. So to get on to our discussion, so far today we've shared who SAN is, that we have a variety of resources that are accessible, the foundations of state oversight, the importance of knowing the location of your out-of-state activities, and then an overview of building relationships with key stakeholders. Our hope is that you can take this information and utilize it in your everyday compliance work. But for this next part of our session, you will all be put into breakout rooms for small group discussion. And we want to build on this idea of building relationships by providing you time to network with your colleagues, discussing your experiences with engaging others at your institution with your compliance work. So the SAN team has provided a discussion and conversation guide to facilitate some topics for discussion. The guide is in a Google Doc, which you can see on this slide. We'll also put it in the chat. We ask that you choose one group member to record some key ideas, some themes of your discussion in this Google document, and to verbally share out for a little bit at the end when we debrief the observations of our discussions. So there'll be approximately 15 to 20 minutes in these breakout rooms. You may not get through all the questions, that's okay. These questions are guides, and if you find that you're having a fruitful conversation on an early question, we encourage you to continue with that conversation. The goal here, again, is to provide the opportunity to discuss engaging with your stakeholders and to share some tips, challenges, and strategies with each other. At the end of the breakout rooms, you should get a notice that the room will be closing in about 1 to 2 minutes. So be on the lookout for that. And if everything's ready to go, we'll be sending you into your breakout rooms momentarily.
Hi, this is Cheryl. We have you set up to go into your rooms. And I just want to point out again that this is for the purpose of understanding who your community is. So I hope you'll stick with us. We've seen that some people have had to leave, which I'm really sorry to see, because the purpose of this is to make sure that you understand your DigiTex community, because this will be the people that you can reach out to support you in your work. So we're about to send you out for 15 minutes, and we look forward to talking with you in just a little bit. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you enjoyed taking part in our group discussions. We find those to be really helpful to be able to learn from each other. So I'm going to turn this back to Catherine, where we'll go with the debrief.
Yes, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you had productive conversations and were able to start building some connections with your DigiTex colleagues. Just to have a quick debrief before our next session, we have a couple of questions we thought we'd see if people be willing to verbally share out to the group. What were some of the key themes and observations from your discussion? So obviously a lot of the questions were centered around your compliance team and how you've managed your relationships across campus with compliance projects. Anything stand out from what people shared in your group?
So I think for our group, one of the things that stood out is we all kind of had this focus on getting buy-in from the people we're trying to collaborate with. That's one of the main obstacles we tended to share. You know, we as the people who like get fed these requirements and compliance needs, we know what we need, but when we try to reach out to collaborators, you know, registrar departments and such, getting buy-in is often the big obstacle that we tend to face.
Were there any, when you discussed that, did you all find any like helpful strategies that you all were able to employ and share that maybe like, oh, this person from this institution did this and this worked well, I could employ that as well?
We're all at different stages, I think, of what we're trying to do and some of the initiatives we're trying to tackle. But I think in general, it's making sure we have kind of what was discussed earlier in this presentation, regular and meaningful communication with the key stakeholders. So, you know, first step, identifying those key stakeholders. Second step, just making sure that they're brought into the fold as far as the conversation. I think those were the main starting points. And I think after that, it kind of gets into the nuances of what works for your institution, you know, things like that.
That sounds great. I'm glad you all were able to find some kind of commonalities there. And buy-in really can be hard, especially at different stages or depending on the relationships that you have with people, how well you know them. It always takes a little bit of time, but hopefully with a little bit of persistence and consistent messaging, you can start making some progress there. Any other observations people would like to share? Either on key themes or maybe how your DigiTex peers can help you in your compliance work?
This is Janet from Denmark College, and John Spradling and I were talking about identification of programs and towards the end, the need for institutional planning, perhaps through curriculum committee, perhaps elsewhere, depends on the structures within each institution. But you know, it was good to hear that there's someone out there who, another institution that may not always catch that, oh, we have another program that's available now, all online. And we also talked about if we're close to a border, you know, could people come across the border just to attend classes twice a week, for example? It's not necessarily just a distance ed thing. It could be an on-campus thing. If you have a student residing in his case in East Texas, Louisiana is just over the border, across the way. So that's certainly doable. So that was something that we talked a bit about, and not everyone knows all of their programs that are or could be online. And so the could be's, that's the thing sometimes we have to remember to look at.
That's great. And I think it also underscores just building those relationships with other people at the campus, because, you know, depending on your role, you may or may not have, you know, the knowledge of when new programs are going online or where they're being offered. You know, compliance professionals, you know, roles are integrated differently at individual institutions. So hearing how other institutions manage it, and just finding different ways to get involved or to, you know, discover these programs, always really helpful here. I do want to see if there's anyone else who'd like to make any observations. We have a minute or so left before we'll get on to our panel discussion. Or Judith, would you like to make any observations about DigiTex? I know that, you know, in terms of having colleagues at other institutions, it was incredibly valuable when I was at my institution in Kentucky.
You know, one thing I do want to say, Catherine, just in case anyone is not aware, we do have a DigiTex Google group that anyone at a Texas community college or at any of our partner organizations like Acadium that supports our course sharing can join. So if you want to be a member of that and you're not already, just shoot me an email and I'll be sure we get you added to that group, because there have been times whenever there have been some really good discussions regarding state authorization, other regulations, compliance, professional licensure on that list. So let me know if you'd like to join that list. Thanks for the opportunity to give that plug, Catherine.
Yeah, no problem. I know how valuable it is to have regular check-ins, especially if you're a team of one. You know, sometimes you just need the opportunity to have some sort of either, you know, email communication, asynchronous or virtual meeting, just to talk through something with someone who gets it, who's at the same, you know, place that you are, or at least has been where you are and knows how to, you know, kind of guide that conversation and help talk it through with you. So it's incredibly valuable. Let's see, I'll do one last call for any comments. Also, please feel free to use the chat. You can make observations. You know, at some point you could share emails with people if you made some new connections with your DigiTex peers. Definitely make note of that. Let's see, not seeing any. I think since it's the top of the hour, we might go on to our licensing disclosure panel, where we'll give a quick overview of some rules regarding professional licensure notifications, and then answer some questions and take some questions from you. So we will get that started so we have plenty of time.
So if you could go on to the next slide, Catherine, that'd be great. Thank you. Hi, this is Cheryl again. Catherine, that was a great group session that you just led there. Thank you very much. And Rachel set up a real foundation of what we need to address in terms of out-of-state activity compliance. And I'm going to build on that a little bit, specifically in regard to professional licensure notifications. And as Catherine just mentioned, we're going to go over the review the rule very quickly, and then we'll move into our panel discussion and give you all the opportunity to ask your questions. If you go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start with just pointing out where you will find this regulation in the Code of Federal Regulations. You also, as Rachel pointed out, if you look on the SAN website, the homepage, which is a real go-to page for you all, it has the links to a variety of important information, including those 9 tiles that she showed that have direction to those issues that are listed there. And one of them is professional licensure. And you'll find there the hyperlinks to these federal regulations and also some description and resources. But to start with, let's review. So this federal regulation, its compliance is tied to participation in Title IV HEA programs. We talked about that just a little bit earlier. So for professional licensure notifications, I like to break it down into elements, some key things that I can remember. And of course, there are nuances and explanation in regard to each, but let's start with these 4 key elements. First, that these regulations address all modalities. So we're talking about face-to-face and online programs. Second, it's important to understand the type of educational program that is subject to notifications. We'll talk about that very specifically because the federal regulation defines what type of program requires these notifications. Third, we know that there are times when public notifications are required. And so we want to know what the information is that needs to be provided in terms of a public facing notification, or make available, as the language of the regulation indicates. And then finally is the times when a direct or not individualized notification is required. Can we move to the next slide, please? So let's start with the type of educational program. This is described in the federal regulation. And although we provide a lot of analysis about the regulation, we break it down for you all. I always encourage people to look at the regulation directly. I think there's no substitute to reading it yourself, but also to have these resources that support your knowledge after you've read the regulation. But very specifically, the regulation indicates that it's the type of program that is designed to meet educational requirements for a specific professional license or certification that is required for employment in an occupation. or it's advertised as meeting such requirement. And why is that important? Because sometimes we find that the marketing department at an institution may get the idea to help promote their coursework as meeting the any sort of required license or certification, that the program would meet that. And so if it's advertised as such, even if it wasn't designed for it, if it's advertised as such, then the institution is under an obligation to provide notification. And what type of information is that? So it's having to do with whether completion of that program is going to meet licensure requirements in a state for that occupation. So it's really like a checklist. So you can look at your programs and decide if it's the type of program that meets these items that are listed as part of the definition within the regulation. If we go to the next slide, please. So what exactly is required? So I indicated that there are public notifications. So what do you have to provide? You're going to look at all states in the United States and territories, because the definition of states in the Code of Federal Regulations in 600.2 indicates that where it indicates states, that it means states and territories. So you're going to be providing a list of states in which the institution has determined that the curriculum meets state educational requirements, a list of states for which the institution's determined that the curriculum does not meet educational requirements, and then a list of states for which the institution has not made a determination whether its curriculum meets the state educational requirements. So it's 3 different types of determinations that you're going to consider for those types of programs that you have indicated are programs that require a notification. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so based upon what the determination was that you made for the public notifications, you may be required to provide direct notifications. These are individualized to the student in writing, and it indicates that in the regulation in this subsection that a writing is considered, an email is considered sufficient for a writing. So under 2 circumstances will you be providing these direct notifications. First, in regard to the prospective student. So if you have determined that the curriculum does not meet, or you've not made a determination where the prospective student is located, then you must provide that notification to that effect to the student prior to the student's enrollment in the program. So what we're talking about is the prospective student, where they're located prior to enrollment in the program. So what does that mean? Well, prior to enrollment in the program has been indicated by the guidance of the department to be prior to a financial commitment. So this is a determination your institution will make in terms of what is the consistent practice that you want to consider about prior to a financial commitment, which will drive when you are providing that type of direct notification to the student. And then there's the enrolled student. So if the institution has made the determination that the program no longer meets requirements in the state where an enrolled student is currently located, the institution must provide notice to that effect within 14 calendar days of making that determination. So these could be in the circumstance where you have an enrolled student in a state where the requirements have changed. And so once you've made that determination of a change, then you have 14 calendar days to notify that student. Or if the student has changed location, and if that's the case, and where they're located it does not meet educational requirements in the state, then you would be providing that notification to the student. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then there is also in regard to SARA compliance. So this has to do with the institutions that are providing distance education. So if they are relying on reciprocity for purposes of state institutional approval, then there are requirements per SARA Manual Section 5.2. So there's always been a SARA Manual Section 5.2 since the beginning of the manual. However, when the federal regulation that came about in 2019 became effective in 2020, on the eve of it becoming effective, the SARA Manual was changed to align with the federal regulation, indicating that the institution, for purposes of SARA, must follow the federal regulation, the federal requirements under 668.43 that we just talked about. And for SARA purposes, these requirements are applicable to not only Title IV institutions, because as we talked, those federal regulations tie to participation in Title IV, but also for SARA purposes, these requirements will apply to non-Title IV institutions. And the other slight difference in regard to SARA oversight is that in the circumstance where the institution is unable, after all reasonable efforts, to determine whether the program meets state educational requirements. So we're talking about that third circumstance where you're indicating that there's no determination. For SARA purposes, the institution is to make all reasonable efforts to make that determination. And if that is not able to be obtained, then the institution is to provide the student with the current contact information for the applicable licensing board and advise them to make a determination whether the program meets educational requirements in that state. We go to the next slide, please. So that was a very quick overview, because we wanted to just set the stage for a panel discussion. And Rachel and Catherine are going to join me now with several questions that we know are frequently asked questions. And we would love to take your questions as well. These are meant to encourage you to ask your questions and hopefully catch upon some that have been important to you as well. So these questions are coming about in terms of public policy, about resources, and also the structure of notifications. So actually, I'm going to take the first question. This has to do with kind of the public policy structure. So why isn't it, the question is this, why isn't it the student's responsibility to know what the requirements are in their home state? And I would say that I've received this question on occasion, and I find it to be a good question. It's something that historically has been something that's been identified by the institution as the responsibility of the student. However, the department began to discuss the importance of notifications and transparency in a negotiated rulemaking back in 2014. And they find that this is so specialized that to have a young applicant or a young enrolled student in a professional program or beginning a professional program, they are not in the same position to be able to provide analysis of a curriculum to determine whether whether those requirements will meet the state educational requirements in a state to be able to sit for licensure. So clearly, the institution has subject matter experts who understand curriculum and understand elements to be in a better position to make those determinations. So it has been placed back on the institution to be able to make those determinations to be able to be transparent with the student. So I'm going to move on to a resource question. So, and this has to do with something that we talked about earlier in the session. So this is for Rachel. So Rachel, does the curriculum meet state educational requirements by participation in a professional compact?
Sorry, I'm hunting for my mute button there. This is I think a common point of confusion for many, and we do understand. We have to recall sort of the purpose of these compacts and these reciprocal agreements, right? They're unique in scope and structure, and they're complementary to existing regulatory structures. So these compacts are really focused on specific requirements which support someone's ability and mobility to practice in a number of states that participate in this compact. But what's really important to keep in mind is they're focused on post-licensure typically. So after the student has completed their educational experience and once they've obtained an approval in a particular state at that level to practice a profession. So at the institution level, it's important still to ensure that the program is meeting the requirements where that student is studying so they can obtain that license. And then once they've obtained that initial license, they then can make use of these compact structures. And there are two of these which come to mind. There's one that's focused on educator certification. And then there's also a national nursing compact that many of us refer to in this work. So it's important if you are making use or communicating with your students about these compacts that you're communicating about sort of the coverage and limitations of how they can be used and how that interplay exists with their educational programming and training. Cheryl and Catherine, feel free to hop in and add to that.
Well, Rachel, you've answered that beautifully. And I think that some institutions have relied on the participation of their state participation in a compact to encourage the student to obtain a license first and then be able to have a easier path to transfer a license or to obtain a license in yet another state that's a member of the compact. But I think, as Rachel pointed out, and I wanted to just underscore this, the fact that these are post licensure is really important to remember, that these are after the student has obtained the first license. So it does not absolve the institution from the responsibility of providing notifications about whether the curriculum itself meets the state educational requirements for the first license.
I'm going to put in the chat to a link to the State Authorization Network Special Interest Team. They're a group who has delved deeply into some operational considerations for institutions, and they did a really great myth and fact white paper about this that you can access and share with maybe the program level expertise that you're working with at your institution on these sort of approvals.
Great,
I'll
thank
find
you.
it.
Thank you. Yes, they did a very good job, and they actually did, and Rachel may have said this, but they did interviews with leads of those two compacts, which was really helpful to underscore, the information that we just shared. So I'm going to move to structure of notifications with a question for Catherine. And this is one that we hear on a regular basis, actually. So Catherine, what if the institution has a program that meets most of the educational requirements in a state? Can the institution indicate yes, except for the different requirements that don't meet?
I think in answering this question, it's kind of best to think of it in terms of risk. So yes, disclosures should only be used in cases where a program unequivocally meets all of the educational requirements for licensure. It's not wholly accurate to say yes, except. Another way to look at it is to think about, what if the student only looks at the yes or the no? Is that fully accurate? If they only look at the yes and do not look at the except, they don't have the full picture. It's potentially misleading. And just from a risk perspective, the yes disclosures are the most risky to your institution if they are wrong, or if they're interpreted wrong, because there's the greatest risk of harm to the student if they rely on that disclosure and it ends up being incorrect. So you really want to be careful about making sure that the language is abundantly clear, and that the program unequivocally meets licensing requirements if that's how you disclose that. An alternative you may consider is, in this case, an alternative strategy might be to say like a no disclosure, like a no but or a no however. Those would be a little more acceptable. You can give a little more context in these disclosures. You can provide extra information that's permissible. The Department of Education in the preamble mentioned there might be a marketing advantage to providing more information in these disclosures. You want to make sure what you provide is correct. But you could consider drafting something along the lines of like, no, it does not meet the requirements. However, it helps meet all the requirements except this one. If we would strongly advise whatever strategy you may want to choose. If you want to provide extra information, just running that by your institution's council or senior leaders, whatever the case may be, whoever has to make those decisions, to confer and see how they think the best strategy on drafting those determinations and the disclosure language would be.
That's a great answer, Catherine. Thank you. Yes, Catherine just shared with us about providing more information, pointing back to the federal regulation requires merely one of those three responses. And for purposes of SARA, for your programs that are subject to SARA oversight, there is that additional responsibility of sharing in the direct notification the information for the licensing board if you're not able to make a determination. But the minimum requirements have to do with simple answers as opposed to more explanation, which we do understand that some institutions want to share. And they also indicate to us that marketing has often indicated to them that they don't want to be so negative. However, it is very important. I really appreciate that Catherine brought up about misleading, because we do know there is a misrepresentation federal regulation, and there likely state misrepresentation regulations and statutes as well that people will want to consider when they're providing information to students. So thank you for that answer, Catherine. Rachel, did you have anything? Okay. Oh, here we go. I just received a message from one of our folks here, and it goes right to the question that I wanted to ask Rachel. So this has to do with resources. Rachel, are there resources to help research the state requirements?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. We understand how daunting it is to pursue these approvals and understand the various requirements. Given we are 50 states, we're also 50 states with multiple regulatory boards, oversight, laws, regulations. So it's a lot to manage. Unfortunately, there's no sort of single repository of information which houses requirements. So it truly is a state by state or profession by profession endeavor. But there are some really great resources available out there, and through the State Authorization Network for operational purposes. You'll find checklists to formulate your disclosures. There's a board research template that's an Excel document that's really handy. And we also have a handbook that talks about sort of the in-depth written sort of context around these rules and processes. In terms of directories, though, we have a couple resources or matrices that we offer on our website. And really how you can use these is sort of to find an initial point of contact and reference to a board or agency. So it really helps to narrow how you find information on that state by state or profession by profession basis. So we have a matrix, and these require your SAN website login for national associations of state licensure boards. And embedded in that matrix and those websites, you'll find licensing requirements and tools, as well as directories to state information. So that's a really sort of good starting point to find information. There's another public resource that's available through the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreements and CSARA. They're the entity who helps to support the operations of SARA, the agreement. And they have the most common licensed professions parsed out by state. Again, that's a great starting place to access a single point of information or contact to then research respective state agency information. So those are a couple of starting points that come to mind. With that and utilizing those resources, I would encourage you to tap into your institution and the subject area experts that you work with to talk about your respective program areas and really get involved in parsing out the information and requirements that you find on a profession by profession basis. So utilize the subject area expertise at your institution to interpret those regulations and compare your programs against those regulations. Cheryl and Catherine, I'm sure you have a couple other resources or suggestions that you may want to add on there.
I really, I'm sorry.
I was just going to quickly note the value of using your peer network in a lot of different ways. They could help start research if you find you're having struggle. Finding someone who's maybe been through it before can guide you in the right direction. Also could help, see how they answered some questions, get a little bit of feedback, some like best practice research. Or if you're having trouble contacting them, maybe putting out a question to your network of like, did you have success reaching this board or finding this regulation and seeing what you get back. I found that a valuable resource in my state's network. So definitely consider that some people may have some of these resources that can help you. But one note of caution I'd make there is you want to make sure you still do the work and make a determination for your own institution, because what they did and how they determined it may not apply at your institution. So while discussing it with others, getting an initial assessment, getting the resources in general are good for your peers. You do want to make sure that your ultimate determination is based on your own institution.
Great, thank you. All I was going to point out is that the URL for the National Associations of State Boards is in the chat. And if you are looking for your login information to be able to access login for member-only resources, please reach out to Heather or Judith. They have the applicable login credentials for your membership for DigiTex to be able to use the SAN website member-only resources. And specifically that one, they are the State Boards URL will bring you to about 35 different national associations of state boards, such as nursing, teacher education, physical therapy, counseling. And some of these have done a very good job of, and the URL will get you there to the how to access the states. So it'll have either an alpha list or a map where you can click on the state. Some of them have the practice acts very available to you, from that link. So they are a good resource for getting started with your research. But as Catherine points out, Rachel points out, institutions and programs are unique, which is why we simply offer the ability to have the direction to the practice acts, because you're going to have to read and see how they're applicable to your curriculum at your institution. So I'm going to do one more question from our panel discussion, and then I would like people to start thinking about what questions they have over our whole 90 minutes together. But I'm going to end this with one for Catherine. So this is looking forward. We have a rather active Department of Education with negotiated rulemakings occurring, et cetera. And so I was wondering, Catherine, this is for you and your crystal ball. So is it likely that the current administration will change this professional licensure notification rule again or remove it altogether?
It can be difficult to predict an administration's regulatory agenda, but it seems unlikely the current administration will change it or remove it. Removing the rule altogether is the most unlikely. Based on the department's priorities that they've communicated, there's been a focus on consumer protection, and the current priorities that they have outlined have not included revisiting these regulations. So it seems very unlikely that they would overhaul them altogether. Another note is that these regulations, they were negotiated under the prior administration, but they did reach consensus among all the negotiators. So it wouldn't be unheard of to revisit it this early, but it seems very unlikely that it would be thrown out altogether. If they were to take any actions, it'd be most likely to rewrite it some. I would anticipate that it would be more likely to be rewritten to require more information in the disclosures along the lines of what was in the Obama era regulations as they were written. So I would anticipate them staying the same, at least for the time present. Maybe in a year or two down the road, the department may revisit, but they have a pretty full regulatory agenda. So I don't know that they'll be getting to it anytime very soon, if it's even on their agenda.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. And as we know from watching how the process works for negotiated rulemaking, even if they set it up to be a part of a rulemaking that we haven't heard of yet, it goes through quite a process. So it would still be several years, even if they were to start the process before there would be an effective rule. So that was a great answer, Catherine. Thank you. Okay, so we have 3 minutes left. And we want to be able to let Judith have the last word, of course. So we'd like to take any other questions that you all may have, given any of the content that we shared today. I'll just talk while waiting for questions to come in, just to share with you that the recording is going to be available. The slide deck will be made available as well. So you will have these as resources. Oh, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel. She can talk about our upcoming events.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to make sure we get these in there. We have a couple upcoming events that may be of interest. We do have a basics workshop that goes in depth in sort of the fundamentals of what you need to know to develop a compliance plan and understand those state-by-state procedures pertaining to your institution's operations outside of its primary state. That will be in March. There is a fee associated with it. It's a virtual event. It'll take place over the course of 3 days, broken up into about 4-hour chunks. And there is a discounted rate for SAN members available, but it's a great opportunity if you're relatively new to the subject, or if you have others at your institution that are interested and new to this work as well. We work with a number of people nationally, so you'll be able to sort of enhance your network and get to know or immerse yourself in those basics. We also have an upcoming webinar in international compliance, and this is a free open event. You'll find the link to register on our homepage. And this will be a great panel presentation facilitated by Catherine. Should your institution be considering operating overseas, an overview of what to consider and some sort of general information about what we know in operating in this international space. And finally, and I think Catherine, or I'm sorry, Cheryl, you likely spoke to this earlier, we do have an upcoming collaboration at the Nassau Conference. This is an event where institutions can come and learn alongside of their state regulators. Through SAN, we'll have a half-day meeting embedded in that agenda. It's a great opportunity. It is in person in New Orleans in April. And there is a discounted rate available for that as well. So reach out to us if you have any questions, but please join us. You'll find all of these things on our website as well. I think, Heather, I'll turn it to you just to wrap up and share any final remarks.
Yes, I did want to just say thank you to everyone for joining us. And if on your way out, you wouldn't mind, I have dropped a link to a survey in the chat box. Just take a few moments to fill that out and let us know what you thought of today's meeting and give us some ideas for the future.
And I'd like to follow up by thanking Heather for organizing this meeting, for thanking everyone for joining us today, and mostly for thanking Cheryl, Catherine, and Rachel for leading this meeting and being such a wonderful resource for our consortium in all things related to state authorization, regulation, compliance, licensure, etc. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you joining us, and please stay safe and well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janet.